All right, guys, so good evening. So we at another class and we are continuing from where we left off last time. We're still on the topic of decimals and we are now continuing from where we left off. We did look at some rounding off in the previous class. So I just want to do a quick recap of the rounding off and then we move on. All right. Now, anybody remember what it means to round off numbers and why we round off? Anybody? Ms. Cummins, can you shed some light on that for us? Why do we round off numbers? Are you there?
Sir, I don't quite remember how to explain it.
Oh, you don't quite remember. Anybody else want to assist Ms. Cummins with the reason for rounding off? Ms. Shea, are you there?
Yes, sir.
You want to tell us why? Give me a reason why we'd want to round off numbers.
Okay, sir. Give me a minute.
Sir, can I?
All right, go ahead, Mr. Campbell, if you have an answer.
Sir, it's basically to get, like, I don't want to say the maximum limit, but I think I remember something from, it said limit above or something, because I was reading before class, so it says something to round to limit above.
All right.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Ms. Wasom. Miss Shay, you want to give me your reason now?
Yes, sir. So I was looking back in my notes, sir, and I remember I telling you that it helps us to use them easier and to understand them, sir, and it shows us how closest a number can go to like the value.
Okay, all right. So for those who just came in, the question is, why do we round off? What is the reason? And we have heard from two persons so far. Anybody else want to share their view of why we round off numbers? Should I call on some other names? Like Ms. Wasom?
When we round off, it gives us a concise form of what the number should be.
Okay.
So we round off to get a concise form of what the number should be.
Okay, all right. So sometimes we do it for conciseness. Sometimes we do it for approximation. Sometimes we do it to somewhat get our value to as closest to what is meaningful to us in terms of our value. Because sometimes we may have, like, even in terms of decimals, we may have a long string of decimal places behind the point. And when you do some calculation, you will see that sometimes the decimal may be just going on and on and on. And so in order to get a meaningful value, one that is closest to what we're looking for, we oftentimes round off the ones that are not so meaningful. All right, because for instance, if we are rounding off in terms of dollars, then we know that we don't need no more than 2 decimal places after the point when we're dealing with dollars and cents, because anything come beyond that will be of no use to us. So that's pretty much why we round off. Now, the other question I'm going to be asking is, anybody remember the procedure that we follow when we're rounding off? Michelle, you want to say something?
Sir, I didn't hear the last part. Can you please repeat?
Okay, I was saying that we round off for various reasons. Miss Williams had said for conciseness. Conciseness really means a shortened form of what the answer would be. So we round off to a shortened form without actually losing what the value is. And so that's one reason. And I was saying that another reason is that we round off because we want to have our value to the most meaningful value relating to our answers. And because there are times when we may do a calculation and the amount of decimal places that comes after the point may not necessarily suit our answer. So even though the calculation might be what I must say most accurate when without rounding off, when you don't round off, your answer is most accurate. But there are times when if we have that long string of decimal, it becomes a little awkward to be writing out that for an answer. So we round off, as Ms. Williams emphasized, next, we round off so that we want to get a close approximation to the value as much as possible. Is that clear to you, Ms. Shay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, you want to add anything else? If not, I'm going to be moving on. So what would be the procedure or the steps that we follow when we're rounding off? Anybody remember? Anybody? All right, remember our number, guys. Our number system is in the form of a decimal system. And so for each digit in our number system, we know that we have what we call place values, right? Now, looking at this number, we would have done this before, but just to refresh your mind, looking at this number, this is $389, right? Now, what are the place values that we have in this number? Mr. Campbell, what place values we have in this? What are the place values?
110 and ones, sir.
All right, 110s and ones. Now, if you want to round off where you're not looking to pay much attention to the ones place value, but you want to round off to the nearest 10, then what it simply means is that we have to identify that place value that we're going to round off to. So that would be the first step. Identify where we're rounding off to, which position we're rounding off to in terms of the place value. And once you have done that now, what would be the next step? Anybody? So in this case, if we are rounding off to the nearest 10, then we look for the place value of 10. So in this case, the 10 place value would be at where the 8 is positioned. Now we want to round off to that place value. That means any value that follows that position will be a value that we don't really are paying much attention to. So we may want to just, in the case of whole number, replace it with a 0. In the place of decimal, if it comes after the decimal point, we may drop off that number. All right, so how do we go about rounding off here now? Anybody want to jump in and say something?
So you pay attention to the
All right, just
to the 9.
just to give a little order, maybe I should ask first. Just raise your hand and then I just call on somebody. Was that you, Miss Waysam?
No, sir, that wasn't me.
Okay, because I heard 2 different voices all at once. All right, Mr. Campbell. All right, continue.
So they're going to look at the 9, pay attention to the 9. And if the 9 is greater than 5, you're going to add 1. You're going to add 1 to the digit in the tens place. And if it's less than 5, you're going to put 0.
All right, Miss Ashanti, you want to add something to that?
Yes, sir. You will try to find out if the 9 is closer to 10 or if it's closer to 0.
Right. And how do we find that out?
So if it's 5 or greater, then it's closer to the 10. But if it's less, then it's closer to the 0.
Exactly. So we look at the number that follows and to see whether or not that number is closer to 10 or closer to 0. Now, if it is closer to 10, it means that the place value that we're rounding off to, we can just simply round up by adding 1. But if that value that follows is less than 5, we say it is closer to 0. So because it is closer to 0, it means that we wouldn't have add a 1. Because when you think about 9, 9 is closer to 10. And every time we reach 10, we would have added 1 to the 10th column in our addition or so on. Is that clear to you guys? Have I lost?
Sir, please repeat that.
Yes, sir.
All right, so I was saying here, what we look for is the number that follows the position that we're rounding off to. Here we are rounding off to the position of 8, which is the 10th place value, right? Now that number that follows, because that number going to either be replaced with a 0, in this case as a whole number, we want to know whether or not we are to add 1 to the 8. If this number is closer to the value 10, meaning that we take a value of 5 or more to be closer to 10. So if the number is equal to 5 or greater than 5, we say that that number is closer to 10. So in the sense, if you're counting from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the 9 is closer to 10. Do you agree? Raise your hand if you agree with me.
Yes, sir.
If you're counting 1, 2, 3, would that value be close to 10? Yes.
No, sir.
No. So if this number was a 3 instead of a 9, it would be closer to 0 than 10. Do you agree? Ms. Clark,
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
you're in agreement with what I'm saying? So
Yes, sir.
the only time we round up, meaning that we add 1 to the column that we're rounding after, the only time we add 1 to the column we're rounding after is when that value is closer to 10. And we take any value 5 or more to be closer to 10. So if the value is 5 or more, we're going to add 1 to the 8. If it's less, we're going to ignore adding 1 and leave that position. We just fill in that position with a 0. So let's look at, say, 2 scenarios. So one, if you have 3, 8, 4, and we're rounding off to the 10th column, it means that this 4 would be less than 5. And so in rounding off, we wouldn't bother to add a 1 to the 8, but instead we can't drop the 4 off in whole numbers. If it was after a decimal point, we would just drop it off, but we can't do that for whole number, because if we drop off a place value, it means that we're going to affect the actual value what the number is supposed to be. But this is actually saying 384. If you drop off this 4, you're going to get 38, which is not representing of the true value. So in order to represent what the true value is, the number that we are rounding off, we replace it with a 0. In this case, because it is less than 5, we wouldn't be adding 1 to our 8. Only values 5 or more, we will add 1 to the 8. And so we would just write back the 38. And now we are rounding off, so that means the number that comes after that position that we're rounding off to, we're going to replace that with a 0. And so in this case, this would be what? 380. In terms, if it is dollars, we'll be having $380 here. That is if we are rounding off this value to the nearest tens. If we're rounding off this one that we have here to the nearest tens, now we have a different situation. The 9 is greater than 5. That means closer to 10. So in this case, we need to add 1 now to the 8. And so if we add 1 to this 8, we get 9. And then that position where this 9 would have been in, we would have just now replaced it with a 0. And so the new value after we round it off to the nearest 10 would be just simply $390. Let me see the hands of those who understand what was said and is clear. All right. Now, so in rounding off, we may find ourselves rounding off whole numbers, and this is an example of rounding off whole number. And remember what I said, we are rounding off values based on whichever place value we're rounding off to. So in this case, we're rounding off to the 10. Suppose we were rounding off this number to the nearest 100, the same number that we have here. Suppose we were rounding this off to the nearest 100, what would be the answer? Let me find a person to ask. Go ahead, Miss Shay. What would be the answer?
So 390?
If we are rounding, this
No,
is the
no.
closest to the nearest 100.
Not the hundreds.
What would it be? What
So
that?
like how the 9 is greater than 5, so we would add 1 to the 8. So we will get 399 or 400.
All right. So just a clarification to what you're saying, Ms. Shay. You see, whatever place value that we're rounding off to, we first
Yes,
add that place value. So what we're rounding off to?
100, sir. So it would be 400.
So we want to round off where the 3 is, because that's the 100 column, right? You follow
Yes,
what I'm saying?
yes, sir.
So we first identify the position that we're rounding off to in terms of the place value. Now, at all times, that's the first thing you do, because the number that we're going to examine must come immediately after that position. You understand what I'm saying, Ms. Shay?
Yes, sir.
So it means that in this case, we don't care about this 9. Ignore the 9. What we really are interested in is the immediate number that comes after the position we're rounding after. That is the one that we are examining to see whether or not it is less than 5 or more. You get what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
So with that said, what do you think the answer is supposed to be now?
400.
400, correct. Because it means that we're rounding off to this place value, which is 2. So we examine the number that comes after. 8 comes after, it is greater than 5, closer to 10. So that means we're adding 1 to this 3. Now, once we add 1 to the 3, this is the place value that we want to round off to. It means that any other place value that comes after, we're going to replace them with zeros. So by adding 1 to 3, we get 4. And now replacing the position of the 8 and 9 with zeros, we would get 400. That clear to everyone? Let me see the hands of those who are following and understand exactly what I'm saying. All right, good. Is there anybody who is not so clear on it and would like me to give a better clarification? All right, so I take it then that we are all on the same page of the procedure of rounding off. So first you find the position that you're rounding off to in terms of the place value. Then we examine the number that comes immediately after that position to see whether it's less than 5, equal to 5, or greater than 5. Less than or greater than 5.
This one with a lesser number, the one with the number that is less than 5.
All right, so for the place, so for the same number, we're going to look at some other rounding off, but in general, just to show one example, if you have 300 now and 40, let me use another number. Let us say 303. Is that okay, Ms. Green?
Yes, sir.
All right. So if we are rounding off to the nearest, let's say we are rounding off to the nearest tens. Following me?
Yes, sir.
Which column, which place value, which number we're rounding off to, which is the place value position that we're seeking to round off to?
10 columns, sir.
All right, so what number is in that column?
0.
0, right? So we want to round off to that column where the 0 is. What is the next step after identifying which column we're rounding off to? What's the next step, Ms. Green?
Number beside the 0, you will identify if it is 5 or more or less than 5.
So the number that immediately follows that 0, we want to see whether it's less than 5. Now, what do we do if it is less than 5?
We put back
So we just ignore it. We don't bother.
Ignore, yes, sir.
We just ignore it. So in this case, a number less than 5, it don't mean anything to us. So that tells you that we cannot add any 1 to the place value that we're rounding after. So if it is less than 5, we just say, just replace it then with a 0. So in this case, what we would have, what would be the answer?
300.
300.
Is that clear to everybody?
Yes, sir.
Right, so that's what it would be. Is that now clear to you, Miss Green?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. All right, so that's it, the idea behind rounding off. Now, we find ourselves not just rounding off whole numbers, but we also round off decimal places. And we also round off based on what we call significant figures. Now, this is another example where we have $28.62 and we're rounding it off to the nearest 10 cents. So we look for the 10-cent column, examine the number that follows. In this case, the 10-cent column would be the 6, and the number that follows it, which is the 1 cent. So this is just 2. And because that is less than 5, we're just going to replace that number with a 0 and ignore adding 1. All right, so that's just another example. All right, moving along now. When we talk about the procedure, this is generally the rule that we follow. So it's not to what you call it, not to labor the point, because I think everybody gets the idea what we're doing now. Ms. Shea, you want to ask a question? So this here is the rules that
Repeat what you said, sir, if I want to ask a question.
yeah, because I see your hands up, so I'm just asking it.
Oh, Sorry, sir. Maybe I need to lower it.
Okay. All right. Now, here's another one where you're rounding off to the nearest 10. So it's just another example. And everybody should see why this is 140. Is that clear to everyone? All right, so in general, if we're rounding off numbers, we can either round off based on significant figures or decimal places or whole numbers. Now, my question to you, how do we know decimal places? How do we define decimal places, students?
So when they
Any
use
number behind the
approximate,
point.
Sir, the digits tells us what decimal place it is in.
All right. So in terms of decimal places, we just simply see how many numbers come after the point, we count them, and that tells you how many decimal places we have. Now, as I had mentioned before, sometimes we have a long string of decimals that come after the point, and we don't need all of them. So sometimes we need to round some off so as to get a concise answer, as what Ms. Williams was saying. All right, now let us kind of compare what significant figure is with decimal places. Anybody know what it means by significant figures? Mr. Ajano, I haven't heard anything from you today, so. Do you want to tell us what figures are?
Sir, I don't know what they mean.
Could you repeat yourself? What? All right, Mr. You want to say something here?
Yes, sir. Significant figures are numbers that are meaningful, sir.
All right. So, all right. So they are classified as meaningful figures. Now, how do we read our significant figures? Where do we?
The first non-zero digit, sir.
This first non-zero digits. Now you have to be a little bit more specific with that, Ms. Waysom. First non-zero digit from which side, left or right? If we look at this number here, 135, what would be the first significant figure, Ms. Waysom?
One, sir, will be the first non-digit number from starting from the left.
Right. So when we are counting our significant figures, we count the first, starting with the first non-zero digit from the most position. So in a similar way to how we count decimal places from the left to the right, is the same way we count significant figures from the left to the right. But when we count significant figures, we're now not just thinking of the digits that come after the point. So we're not just focusing on decimal places, but we are focusing on all the figures in the number. And we start counting with the first non-zero of the number. Now, suppose I have 135.452. And I say, round this off to 5 significant figure. What would be the answer, Ms. Wilson?
135.45, sir.
Right. So what is happening here, and I hope everybody is paying attention, when we are counting our significant figures, we start with the first non-zero digit from the left. Now, it is very important that we understand what we mean by that, right? So we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we count the first 5 digits from the left. Then now, if we are rounding off now, we need to round off to that final significant figure. So the one that follows, we do the same thing. We examine it. If it is 5 or more, we add 1 to the 5. If it is less than 5, we ignore adding 1. Sorry, guys. Voice is a little. All right, sorry about that. My voice get a little hoarse just now. All right, so with that said, when we are counting significant figures, starting from the leftmost position, we start counting from the first non-zero digit. Now look at this one. So if we have 0.0, 1, 2, 3. How many significant figures do we have here?
3, sir.
3.
Ms. Clark, why do we have 3 significant figures?
Because, sir, you're counting the numbers that are more, that is not zero, sir, basically.
All right.
So 1, 2, 3 is not zero, so it's a meaningful
Well,
number.
I don't want you to actually say that you're counting numbers that are not zero, because there are times when 0 will be significant. But in counting, once you're counting from the left to the right, we start with the first non-zero digits. Now look at this one. 0.0, 1, 0,